Hello, welcome back. My name is Ari, and this week we are on to week 3 of reading my TBR shelf. Now week 3 you could probably barely see shelf number 3 right down here. I'm gonna zoom in here in just a second, but this shelf is like a miscellaneous shelf. I have nonfiction books on that shelf, I have mass market paperbacks books on that shelf, and then I have like other genres that are not fantasy, sci-fi, or nonfiction. It's just the other category. I typically tend to buy mostly fantasy, sci-fi, or nonfiction, so that section is very, very small. I'm going to read one book out of each of those 3 categories. And if you watched my TBR video, you may know what books I'm reading already because all 3 of them made an appearance in my TBR for August. But let's zoom into the shelf and talk a little bit about what books I'm reading. Alright, here is that shelf. And as you can see, mass market paperbacks, miscellaneous, nonfiction. Very straightforward. So let's start with the mass market paperbacks, and I am reading Rebecca. Why is this not focused? There we go. I'm reading Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This is a classic. I think it came up as ugly cover on my TBR, and yeah, there we go. In the second category, which is like miscellaneous, I'm going to be reading this right here. This play wants to stay attached, which is The Latin Deli by Judith Ortiz Cofer. This, I believe, is short stories, short prose, short essays, and poetry by this author. This book is for the book covered book club, where the prompt this month is a big bloom on the cover, and as you can see, there is a very large bloom on the cover of this book, and it is particularly short, so should be easy. Now for the non-fiction section, again, this one is something that came up in my Dungeon of Books TBR, which was How to Argue with a Racist. This is for the prompt to read something for Goodreads, which is Goodreads Choice Awards, and this is one of 2 books that I own that I haven't read that was either won or was nominated for Goodreads Choice Awards in 2020. I don't remember. But this is the science and technology category. So I need to read this. So this is my TBR for the week. This one's not as exciting as the other 2 because it's the miscellaneous shelf. So it's just not going to be as exciting. But we've got a classic, we've got a nonfiction, and then this one actually might be a classic too. I don't know much about it. This was from college and I just never got around to reading it in college. No, this is like 1993, so not that old. But yeah, so poetry collection, nonfiction, classic. I think I want to start with the poetry collection and kind of knock this one out today, and then I don't know where I'm gonna go from there. We'll figure it out, but I'll be back in a little bit. Okay, it's Monday and I finished this last night but didn't feel like recording, so I'm recording now. This was interesting. This is not... There's a helicopter again. Why every time I film there's a helicopter? So this book is not really my go-to genre for books. This is literary prose and poetry, and while I don't have anything against literary prose or poetry, it's not something that I typically seek out. But this was interesting because it's so different than like my personal experiences in life that I very, very much enjoyed reading it. So this follows like women, just women in general, specifically Puerto Rican immigrant women, either first or second generation, and most, though not all of these stories, take place in New Jersey in a like barrio or apartment complex called L Building, which is the best name ever. And everybody who lives in L Building is Puerto Rican. So it just kind of goes through, like, it's just different little stories of what these Puerto Rican women experience in their life, being immigrants, and just Puerto Rican culture and racism and spousal problems, loss, death of like children, parents, spouses, loved ones, like just all sorts of different little slice of life stories from these women's perspectives. And it was very, very interesting to read, just because how these children or these women live is so different from how I live or how I lived, how I grew up. It's just a different life experience. So for that reason I enjoyed it. Some of the poems, like the poetry, just didn't really speak to me. It was very hard to follow, which is fine. That's just, poetry is not really my thing, but I liked almost all of the short stories. My favorite one was, what was this called? It was called Corazone's Cafe, and it was very sad, and I cried a lot. But yeah, if you're interested in just slice of life of Puerto Rican women in like the 1970s, 1960s, and 70s, then I would highly recommend this for you. It was fun. Now, the last 3 books that I have read have all dealt with racism in various ways, which don't go off of what you saw in the last video of reading my shelves, because I've read 2 other books between that. But obviously this deals with racism against Puerto Rican women, and then the other 2 books that I've read, which aren't part of my Reading My Shelf challenge, but they're part of my like book boxes, were The Inheritance of Orquídea Divina and Grown, and both of these deal with racism against women. This one's Black women, this is Latina women. So I'm a little too burnt out on racism to read How to Argue with a Racist right now, so I'm going to instead read Rebecca, because this is like all about white people. There's no racism in it. This is just like weird, ghosty, gothic, classic literature. So just a little bit of a break from the harder hitting topics for my own personal mental health, and we're just gonna read some dumb white people classics. So Rebecca is up next. I'll be back in a day or 2 to let you know what I think about this. I'm choosing to DNF Rebecca because I cannot with this book. I can't bear it. Daphne du Maurier's writing is so overbearing, so overly descriptive. It's like pages and pages of descriptions of flowers and fields and things that I just do not care about at all. Like, at all. The main character, or the narrating character, is the unnamed second wife of, what is his name? Maxim de Winter. So she doesn't have a name as far as we're ever told, but she is his second wife. And she is a literal, like, carpet of a human being. She's like, please, please step on me. And everyone just walks all over her. She has no backbone. All of her, like, decisions and her, like, timidness is so annoying to me. I'm just like, none of the shit that happens in this book would ever happen if she took 5 fucking seconds to stand up for herself. I don't care. And then I think I've read the word rhododendron more in the past day than I have my entire life. Daphne du Maurier really likes rhododendrons and likes to say the word rhododendron over and over and over again. So I got, how far am I in here? I'm at 120 pages, right? And I got to a point where I was like, I'm so bored. I don't want to read anymore. And I went and looked up what happens in this book. And this entire book is literally summed up in 2 paragraphs. There's like 2 big events in this entire book, and I'm like, oh my god, that's it. Like, if you get cliff notes of a whole ass book and it's 2 paragraphs when this thing is over 300 pages, that says something about how much padding the writing has happened in this book. And I basically read the Cliff Notes version of it and went, great, I don't care about the rest of this book. So DNFing it, moving on to greener pastures. I've decided to grab a replacement mass market paperback, which is Grey Sister by Mark Lawrence. This is the second book, or the second book in the Book of the Ancestors trilogy. I do want to note that Mark Lawrence has some controversy surrounding him, so you need to decide on your own if his writing is worth, if like you want to support him. I would recommend personally just purchasing his books used if you decide you want to read his books. The highlights of the controversy is apparently the first series that he wrote have some very problematic content as far as like the sexual assault of women goes, and when criticized about the inclusion of this sexual assault, he responded very, very poorly, and has made a habit of harassing people in the past who criticize him. And that has led to a lot of accusations of him being misogynistic and generally problematic. So if I would have known that, I probably never would have read these books and probably wouldn't own them. And a lot of it is like he said, she said. I am in the habit of believing women, just personally. So for me, I would have chosen to either purchase the books used or not. I probably wouldn't have read them at all. I've got so many other things that I can read that I'm just like, yeah, I probably wouldn't have read them if I would have known that before I purchased the books. But I have the books, so I'm gonna go ahead and finish off the series and then probably never read anything by Mark Lawrence again, which is fine. Read what you want. I don't care. So the first book was actually pretty good. I liked it. I not my favorite book in the world. I don't really remember what happened, and I'm not gonna reread it, so hopefully I get a refresher in here, or else I'm gonna be confused out of my mind. But I will come back with this in a little bit. I also started reading How to Argue with a Racist, which Daphne du Maurier was so boring that I started reading scientific nonfiction. That says a lot. But I read the introduction in the first chapter, first part of that book already, and I'll probably read like a little bit of it each day because that's how I prefer to consume nonfiction. But I'll update you when I'm done with this or when I'm done with that one. Alright, I have finished both of these. I was reading like a chapter of this a day and while I was reading this one, and then the one that I DNF'd. But we'll start with this one, and I'm not going to say much about it. The book itself was kind of okay. Like, it's not the type of story that's worth supporting somebody who's not like a great human being, I guess. So I read it, it was fine, I gave it 3 stars. This is the last time you're gonna see me talk about it on my channel. How to Argue with a Racist was a much better book, but also not for me. The title of this is a little bit misleading because, like, you're not going to learn how to argue with a racist in this book. The little bit down here at the bottom, it's what our genes do and don't say about human difference. That's the part that matters. This is a very, very scientific book from a geneticist about race. And basically the whole book just says, from a scientific standpoint, race doesn't exist. Race is a social construct. So this goes into things like saying people, or like genetics tests like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and how they're misleading, not necessarily inaccurate, but misleading, and things like stereotypes, like certain color of people are smarter than other people, or that black people are really fast because of slavery or genetics or stuff like that. It discusses a bunch of different things like that and basically disproves all of those like racist remarks, saying that like basically we understand that genetics will determine some things about you, like the color of your skin, color of your eyes, all of that kind of stuff, but they don't know which gene says you're going to be this color. They know it exists, obviously, but they don't really understand. Like, it's too complicated to understand, and it's definitely too complicated to be used for racist reasons. And a lot of it, like, a lot of the racist assumptions, like, very easily disprove themselves, I guess is the way to describe that. There was a quote in here that I very, very much appreciated that I'm going to read to you. And this talks about racist. So, when all you've ever known is privilege, equality feels like oppression. And that is a very strong statement. So, too scientific for me. If you like science things, you'll probably like it. It's well written. I'm just not smart enough for this shit. So it's only Friday, so I have time to read one more book, I think. So I'm going to read The Wood, which is a horror story that I grabbed off the same shelf, obviously. This weekend is the 1,000 Doors Readathon, and the first prompt that I read for that was a book that's not mentioned in this video. It was basically a book box books that I got, and then the second prompt is a horror story, and this happens to be my miscellaneous shelf. So I've got horror stories on it. So I'm gonna go ahead and read this one and tack it on at the end of the video just as an extra bonus and clearing off another book, because why the hell not? Alright, I have finished The Wood, and this isn't really what I expected from this book. Like, if you look at the cover, like, very horror story, horror book vibes to it, right? This was more portal fantasy than horror, though there were horror aspects to it. I would have just not necessarily called this a horror. I don't know. The cover of this is misleading is basically what I'm getting at. But yeah, portal fantasy, time travel, elf-like creatures. Basically, this girl is in a long line of guardians of this like forest or a wood where there are portals to like different times, and her job is basically to patrol the wood, and anytime she finds somebody who has stumbled through a portal, to make sure that she returns them to their portal and make sure that time doesn't be like, time is not affected. Like, no one can go back to the past and kill baby Hitler, because even though that seems like a great idea to stop the Holocaust, we don't know what the effect to the future would be if something worse could happen. So their goal is to make sure that no one plays with time, basically. Though most of the people that stumble through the portals are just lost people who have no idea what they're doing. And then there's like something bad going on in the wood. This was definitely young adult, which I didn't realize. And it had a lot of insta-lovey young adult tropes to it that weren't really my favorite. In the end, I thought this was okay. It was like a fun little story. It was a super quick read. This just took me a few hours to read. But this is not going to end up being like one of my favorite books of all time, and probably not something that I'm going to really remember much of in like a month or two. So, okay, not great. But that is everything from that shelf in this video. So we got through 5 books technically, because I DNF'd Rebecca, which is fantastic. Well, not the DNF, getting through 5 books is fantastic. Next week's shelf is the final shelf, which is books that I have received or purchased this year. Anything I've obtained in 2021 is on the bottom shelf. Technically it's on the bottom shelf and on this cart, but we're counting this cart as part of the bottom shelf. If you're interested in what I'm reading next week, then make sure you like and subscribe. Come hang out with me again, and I'll see you later. Bye!